Good morning, gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk to you about Japan. Now, it's a very easy topic because Japan, till I think the middle of the 19th century, was a totally introvert country. They were always looking inwards. And that is the time when an American commodore with his naval fleet came to Japan, and the Japanese had no choice but to open up the doors to the foreigners. And they opened up in such a way they lapped up everything which the foreigners told them, including building a navy which was modeled on the American Navy as well as the British Navy. Japan soon began to have imperialistic ambitions, and there was a background to it because there are no minerals available in Japan. You don't get any steel, iron, gas, coal, nothing. And everything has to be imported out. And there came a time when the Japanese needed raw materials and they were thinking where to go about it. So Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese emperor, he had a meeting with the cabinet and decided that they must occupy China. Manchuria, that is part of North China, is rich in minerals, and they said, well, in case we can get hold of this area, we'll be able to replenish our minerals. So that is the start of the problem which started and later on bludgeoned into something very big. Before that, the Japanese had some confidence. There was a Russo-Japanese war in the Far East, where the Russian fleet sailed all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific, but they were badly defeated, and the sea of the Russian fleet was captured. Later he was released, of course. But the fact is, it was a historic event, and it was the first time an Asian power had defeated a Western nation. Now the Japanese were cock-a-hoop, and they went about in a very professional manner. They occupied the whole of Manchuria and carved out a separate kingdom called Manchukuo and put the deposed Chinese emperor Puyi in charge. And once this was done, the League of Nations at that time thought it appropriate to take action against Japan. And the Western powers, led by the United States, imposed a trade embargo on Japan. Now, Japan couldn't withstand the trade embargo because they needed oil, they needed so many things, and once the embargo had been enforced by the US Navy, there was nothing going into Japan. And a stage came in 1940 and toward the end of 41 when the Japanese had only, I think, about 15 days of fuel left. So a war cabinet meeting took place under General Tojo, and they had a talk with the Emperor Hirohito, who agreed with them. In fact, Emperor Hirohito is instrumental in the rise of Japanese militarism. So a plan was hatched to launch an attack on America on Pearl Harbor. I think it was on December 1941 when this attack was planned. And the Japanese fleet, commanded by Admiral Nagumo, sailed towards Hawaii, which was the main base of the Americans in the Pacific. Now we all know what happened. I think you must have seen there's an excellent movie made on Hawaii. The Japanese struck and almost decimated the Japanese fleet. But they missed one very important point, and that is the aircraft carriers. Now the Japanese had realized that the war in the ocean is no longer going to be a battle between surface ships. And now they were more concerned with the modern warfare, which involved the use of aircraft and aircraft carriers in seaborne fighting over vast expanses of the ocean. And they had built up their own carrier fleet also. Now, when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, They decimated the American fleet. Many of their battleships sank, and the Americans suffered about 1,200 casualties. But at the same time, they missed hitting the carriers which were out in the ocean carrying out exercises. I don't know whether to call it God's will or whatever it may be, but that was a fatal blunder. And Nugumo should have just waited instead of turning back and radioing the fact that the attack had been successful. Because I don't think that attack could be considered successful because the Japanese fleet had not been able to annihilate the American carriers. And these carriers now began to regroup. And within 6 months of this, they were able to inflict a very crushing defeat of Japan in the Battle of Midway in mid 42. And at that time, even perhaps the Americans didn't realize, and the Japanese realized it later, that the clock had started ticking for the end of the Japanese Empire. Because in that battle at Midway, the Japanese carrier fleet was decimated in the loss of only one carrier by the United States. And once that happened, the teeth had been taken out of the Japanese fleet. But the army was rampant, and they, in a swift campaign facing the British, who were, as it is, very hard pressed, took over the whole of Southeast Asia. In 2 years of fighting, they had driven the British out of Burma as well. And since the American priority remained Europe, the American forces were not geared up to invade Japan. But remember one thing, ek baat yaad rakhiyega, the Japanese had a lot of admiration and love for the Americans, and they really admired them. And there's a very excellent movie that how much they admired them, because the Japanese submarine was moving close to the east coast of America, and there was another American girl swimming in the sea, and unwittingly she sat on top of the periscope, and when the Japanese submarine came up to the ocean, she also came up to the ocean, perched on the periscope. And the Japanese were so delighted, they said, "We have reached America, we have reached America, we love America." So that just about shows the ethos of the Japanese. They were enamored of American culture, American life. Now that has had a repercussion later on. But at that time, the Japanese were very cruel on their prisoners of war, and we have the famous Bataan March in the Philippines, where hundreds of prisoners were killed, or rather they died when they were made have a forced march from one place to another in the Philippines. So, gentlemen, the war continued, and at the end of 1944, the Japanese had realized they were going to lose the war. They were looking for a face-saving way out. Now, this is very important because Japan at that time was the end of the teeter, but the Americans were cock-a-hoop because they wanted to conquer and defeat Japan. And as it is, at the Yalta Conference between Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, it had been decided that there would be nothing short of unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. And when the Japanese sent out feelers that they would like to have a détente and call off the war, the Americans said no, and so the fight continued. This was a fruitless fight. For the next few months, the Japanese threw everything they had in the battle, including the kamikaze pilots, the devils, suicide pilots, suicide bombers, ferocious attacks, but they could not win. And maybe it was a fatalist contempt of death which really let them down, because they just went the idea that we're going to die without the idea that we're going to win, and that's very important. And finally, in August 1945, the Japanese were at the end of their rope. They didn't know what to do. And I think all they needed at that time was a push, and the whole Japanese edifice would have collapsed. But the Americans wanted a guinea pig, they wanted to test the nuclear weapon which they had, And there's a famous letter written by Einstein and a few of his compatriots to the American presidents requesting him to use the atom bomb. Now, later on, Einstein and all these people backtracked, but the fact remained that they were people who were absolutely heartless to suggest to the American president to use the atomic bomb on Japan. And the Secretary of State was, I think, Mr. Hull or somebody by that name. This man was given the chance, the option to strike at the cities. And he left out one city where he had been there as a student and decided that two other cities, that is Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would be bombed. And they will be bombed within 2 days of each other. That means you're going to bomb the first city, and without giving the any chance to the Japanese to surrender formally, they would bomb Nagasaki also, so that the experiment would be complete. Because the American military was keen to test the efficacy of the new atomic weapon which they were used. So, gentlemen, these B-50, I think B-29 or B-36 bombers took off, and from Okinawa with the Fat Boy, that is the atomic bombs, and Japan was going to face the tornado of death. And that's precisely what happened. I think more than 200,000 Japanese civilians died. And this is a very important point, because this point came up in the Tokyo trials, where the Japanese leadership was being tried as war criminals. At that time, the Indian member of the jury, that is, member of the judges' jury, made a point, and he said that if we are going to try the Japanese generals and prime ministers for starting the war and killing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, there is a relevant point that we also try the American generals for the deaths of 200,000 innocent Japanese civilians, defenseless civilians, who were killed in the atomic bombing. So, gentlemen, that is the point which to be noted. And of course, General MacArthur didn't like this at all, but that dissenting judgment is available. It is there on the internet, you can read it. But after the war was over and Japan had been destroyed, the Japanese army put the weapons down and said, "Hands up, we give up." But even at that time, when the bombs had been dropped on Japan, the Japanese were controlling vast areas of Indochina as well as Manchuria, that is in China. But very soon the Russians came in, they occupied Manchuria, and the Americans went in and occupied Japan. As far as Southeast Asia is concerned, the French went back there to Indochina, and the Dutch went to the Dutch East Indies, that is Indonesia, and the British reappeared in Malaysia and other places, Singapore. But then, gentlemen, the volcano had been unleashed, and that volcano meant one thing, and that was imperialism was finished. I'll not go into the history, you all know it, what happened. The French were defeated, the British had to leave, and the Dutch also ran away like, what can I say, a rat or a hare. They just ran away. They couldn't control this, and the forces of nationalism were unleashed. Japan, however, forgot all about these atomic bombs which had dropped on them, and this is a mystery to me how the Japanese didn't feel unhappy that these bombs had been dropped on them. In fact, I think it's one of the quirks of the Japanese character which I can't explain, that they welcomed the Americans back there. Americans came into Japan in a big way and helped in the reconstruction of Japan. That's okay. But how can a nation which lost 200,000 defenseless civilians just forgive America? And as it stands now, for the last almost 75 years, Japan has been a strong ally of the United States. Now, it bugs me how this could happen. And the Americans have been in Japan for that time, and they're having a ball there. They have still maintaining bases in Japan, and Japan is one of the pivots for American power in that region. But the Japanese themselves framed a constitution, which is a pacifist constitution, in which they said we will not fight another war. Fair enough. But the fact remains the Japanese still honor their dead, and every year ceremonies are held in Japan all over for the people who died fighting for the emperor in Japan. That means the Japanese still remember the Second World War, but they see it with a different picture. They do not think they went as conquerors and created mayhem and murder. They feel they had started something which was good for the people there because they had set up something called a co-prosperity sphere. It was on paper, and they had some allies coming in, and one of them was Subhash Chandra Bose, the Indian wartime leader. He went and joined the Japanese also. Anyway, gentlemen, despite close relations between wartime Japan and India, after that the Japanese forgot about India. I think they had nothing much to do with India. They were more enamored of the Americans. So they began to adopt American culture, American films, American food, and they even started playing baseball, with this one of the games the Americans like so much. Now, all this is very, very mysterious to me. I would say that it would be a mystery to everybody else. Because what is the fascination the Japanese have for the Americans? And the Americans, I don't think, have done anything for Japan. Now the situation is really changed in the 21st century because there has been a resurgence of China. I'm not a supporter of China. I can tell you China is a terrible country and it's like a bull in a China shop, and somebody's got to control China. Who's going to do it? Let's see. Could it be India? America has got no chance. They got nothing. They can't control China at all. And that is the reason the American leadership think tank decided that the time has come when we must have a detente with China, be friends with them. And that is why Nixon in 1972 made that historic visit to Beijing, threw in the towel, fell at the feet of Mao Zedong, and normalized relations. And he sold South Vietnam away, and ultimately was overrun by North Vietnam. And also, much later, President Clinton gave the green signal to the Chinese to occupy the entire South China Sea, and so the matter is at a very devious point. Japan has been watching all this at the same time keeping quiet, thinking America is going to help us. Japan's defense is part of America's commitment. But everything doesn't happen like that, you see. The Americans' commitment we have seen is on paper, and when it comes to brass tacks, they can't fight. So, gentlemen, the inevitable has happened. America has been having tremendous influence in Japan now. At the same time, they are underwriting the Japanese security. But as I said, it's easier said than done. And if the chips are down, the Americans are not going to come and fight for Japan or for Musa or for anybody. They will fight for their own skin. And that is the point to be noted. But the Japanese are still living in a fool's paradise. And now they are having a bigger problem because the Japanese economy is stalling. And they have a paucity of manpower. The birth rate has gone down. Younger people are not available. And Japan is an aging population. Now, a country which is an aging population cannot become a military power. Japanese respect their army and they are very militaristic in their outlook. But that's about all. They don't have the means to counter China. They are thinking America is going to do it, but I think a realization is creeping into the Japanese that we will not be able to fight China, number one. Number two, America cannot be relied upon. They have seen America throw the towel in Afghanistan. through the trouble in Iraq, they ran away in Vietnam. So, where is the chance the Americans are going to go and fight for Japan or Formosa, Taiwan? And Americans committed another blunder because the island of Formosa was being administered by Japan for since 1900, almost for 50 years till the end of the World War, and they handed it back to China. Had they not done that, and this had remained part of Japan, the whole geopolitical scenario would have been different. But, gentlemen, now as it stands, Japan has this creaking economy, an aging population, and to build up their military now will take them another 25 years, and they are not sure that America will come and help them. Even I'm not sure they're going to do it. So, but their love for America has not changed. And this is what is something which I think psychologists must study, that why a country which had fought the Americans so ferociously, and the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs killing hundreds and thousands of innocent Japanese, still, I would say, as Stalin used to use the word, it's a word which used by the communist jargon, but I can stand here. And Stalin used the word running dog of imperialism. I don't know whether I'd say replace the word imperialism with Americanism. So, gentlemen, I do not know what the future is going to hold, but I think Japan is sinking into oblivion. And until and unless the Japanese assert their identity, give up the notion that America is God, I don't think they can really move forward. They must take a lesson from the way Narendra Modi is dealing with the Americans. And because the Americans understand only one language, and that is force. You want to talk to them, ahimsa and all that, it got no meaning for them. Well, gentlemen, the situation is pretty tense as far as the Southeast Asia is concerned. China has taken control over the South China Sea. Americans are keeping quiet. I don't think they've done anything other than 1 or 2 cruisers going and moving around here and there, which has got no meaning. Even Taiwan is scared what's going to happen. Though Biden has said we'll go to war over Taiwan, I don't think he's going to do it. America doesn't have the force, the manpower. The manpower was required in the battle with China. They don't have that. They're looking to India for it. And Modi is no fool. He's not going to fight America's war or Japan's war with China. The best course of action for the Japanese would be to repent on their war crimes, give up the leadership of Southeast Asia, and at the same time throw the Americans out and see and look or seek their own destiny. I wonder if they have a leader who is going to do that. It looks pretty difficult to me. Anyway, gentlemen, I think I'll close now. Goodbye and God bless. If you like my channel, please share it with your friends, subscribe to it, and come back for more. Goodbye and take care.